I don't know about you, but this whole series looking at obedience, it's very easy maybe just to kind of go, well, that was interesting, let's move on. But actually really thinking it through, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us personally? What does this mean for us as a church family? Anyways, this isn't straightforward because it requires us to engage and actually think through, how am I living my life? What are some of the choices I'm making? And am I making the right choices? Do I need to be thinking about making different ones? We're obviously exploring, through it, what it means to listen and respond to God's leading. That's the heart of this series. And today we're actually going to kind of chronologically jump back a bit. If you were here last week, we were hearing about Huldah and Josiah in 2 Kings 22 and 23. This was the image Jenny used to illustrate something of kind of Israel, Judah, and the various tribes and where they were and settled and that sort of thing during Huldah and Josiah's time. As I say, though, we're going to jump back a bit because this morning we're going to take a look at a particular part of Moses' story and the impact that his obedience had, not just then, but what it can say to us today, and how we, I believe, can be challenged through reflecting on his story. I mean, in a nutshell, we could sum up kind of Moses' obedience in that it was his obedience that led to the Israelites' freedom from slavery, their escape from Egypt. And his obedience enabled God's people to enter the promised land. But we're going to look at a particular part of his story found in Exodus chapters 3 through 14 this morning, where the promised land, it's a pipe dream, really, at that point. Or maybe it's not even reached that stage. And actually, the idea of the promised land is something so forgotten and unrealized that it's not even on their radar in terms of the people of God. Now, I love the story of Moses. It's one of the stories I remember I was talking with Keith just beforehand, something else, but about kind of, growing up in the church and those who, people who impact you and the different things you do and that sort of stuff. And I remember from an early age loving the Ten Commandments and the story of Moses. Particularly, though, because I can remember, I was reminded of this week, sitting in our lounge where we lived in Gunners Lake down in Cornwall as a child, watching Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments. Yes, that's the kind of child I was. The 1956 Oscar-winning epic clocks in at 3 hours 40. Which is a bit crazy. I certainly don't remember sitting there for that long. Maybe the TV probably had like a shrunk version, as they often do. But Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and all that sort of stuff. That was one of my, early memories. But as I say, I love the story of Moses because it is an epic tale. Thus, it's been made into various films and depicted in different ways. And so we're going to come to Exodus chapters 3 through 14 this morning. Now, those of you who are part of a life group will be aware, obviously, we're studying Exodus at the moment in our life groups. It's the first of a series of 7 books that we're going to be looking at in life groups. As part of, they cover 7 different genres within the Bible, all coming from this point of view of what does it mean to live a whole life disciples. And you may recall at the start of the series, whether your group did this or not, there was the suggestion of watching the Bible Project films, which are brilliant films. We use them often here on the Sundays, just in that overview of Exodus. But there was also a diagram that we sent out that kind of captured it. And this is what it looked like, only this one actually was one, I've got the physical copy here, was actually coloured in by a lady, Barbara, who's part of the Thursday group that the Edmondson lead over in Catsfield. She's an amazing artist, is Barbara. Many of you probably remember her sister Mary, who used to come here on a Sunday. And my photo doesn't do it justice. If you actually look at it, the detail within it, it just brings it to life. this account of what took place, what is recorded within the book of Exodus. As I say, we're going to look at a particular part of the book today. And I was quizzed, actually, earlier on. Someone said to me, they'd obviously seen on the rota or something that it's got chapters, 3 to 14. They're like, you picked a lot this morning. How long are we going to be here today? And I genuinely, as I was up in the office this week, I genuinely was thinking, do we read it through in its entirety this morning? And I ummed and ahed about it. And I did actually read it through, all 12 chapters, as I was preparing. It took me about 16 minutes. It probably would take a bit longer, because when you read something, you probably read it quite quickly, and that sort of thing. But reading it through, there's tons of detail, and the to-ins and fro-ins and all this sort of thing. I've decided not to this morning, but I would really encourage you, and you'll see why, to go back and read it through at another point, because it gives this bird's eye view of what is taking place at this time during Moses' life. And as we're going to think about this morning, the different interactions that he has with God. When we started this series, we looked at Noah and his obedience, and there was that phrase of, kind of obedience, in the long obedience in the same direction. For Noah, he basically had to build an ark. That was his job. That was his obedience. With Moses, we'll see there's maybe a bit more to it for him, as we're going to consider this morning. Because for him, his obedience was this choice to follow God. You might kind of think, but that's a bit obvious, isn't it? Because obedience, just going back to, Jenny says, is doing what someone says. So obviously, kind of obedience following is doing what God asks. But actually, I think it's really key for us to grasp that in terms of both Moses' story, but also how this outworks into our lives. And I want to illustrate this morning. As I was preparing this week, I felt God gave me a picture of a maze, just like this one. I've always loved mazes. I've loved them, whether you're on paper or as toys. Those you can physically walk through. There's a great one down in Cornwall I could give you references to. We went to many times. We were on holiday down there. I've loved making mazes. Not surprising there. But obviously with any maze, the aim is to get from the start to the finish. That's what you're trying to do. Now sometimes the finish point might be in the center of the maze, I'll give you that. But with this one, it's going obviously from kind of the left to the right. Going all the way from the start to the finish. So the way you do that is you head in. Okay, you head in until you come to a junction or an opening, and you make a choice. Which way will you go? This way or that? Now, once you've made that choice, you carry on, okay? Until you're faced with another junction or opening, and you make another choice. And so on, and so on, and so on. Choice after choice after choice after choice. And we should be able to head through our maze as we carry through all the way. See, I've got it right first time, every opportunity. Carry on again all the way, right through, until I get to the final bit, or go the other way. No, I go backwards, go the other way, and I come to the finish. Because that's the aim. That's what you're trying to do, obviously, with a maze. And I felt God gave me this picture because I think it speaks something of Moses' story and what he was experiencing during these chapters we're going to reflect on. Choice after choice after choice after choice. Now, I'm going to go through some of them. It's not an exhaustive list, which is, I'd encourage you, as you read through these 12 chapters, maybe at a later point, you can try and count how many. I kind of gave up trying to count how many times Moses is faced with this choice to do what God asks. So let's begin. Exodus 3, verse 4. I'd encourage you to have your Bibles open. We're going to jump around. Moses sees the burning bush. Okay. And he goes over to take a look. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, it says, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here I am. Now, this first point, he could have just ignored it. He could have just, kind of thought, that's just a weird, well, it's just a bush on fire, isn't it? I'm just going to steer clear from that because fire's dangerous. as we all know. Or he could have thought, I see that bush on fire, I hear a voice, but I'm sure it's just one of the sheep, bleating weirdly. Boris, be quiet. That sort of thing, and just carried on his way. But no. And so this conversation begins. God in verse 10 then says, so now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now Moses doesn't jump for joy. He doesn't say, yes, you picked me. Let's go, I'm ready for this, onwards. No, he doesn't really think he's the right person for the job and comes up with these various excuses. In many ways, he obviously thinks he knows more than God knows because God is saying, I'm sending you. But God gives him these practical responses. Chapter 4, verse 3, the Lord said, throw it. He's talking about his staff on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake and he ran from it. Then in verse 6 of chapter 4, then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak. And when he took it out, his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. Finally, after this back and forth, Moses gets on board. And then in verse 19 of chapter 4, now the Lord has said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead, which Moses does. A handful already examples of Moses responding to God's leading. And this instantly, I think, illustrates that point. We might kind of think, well, hold on a second. There's the go and to Egypt and do all this. That's a big kind of thing. The idea to throw the stick on the floor, that's a bit inconsequential, isn't it? It's not really that much of importance. But it illustrates that time and time again, these little things that Moses is asked to do. Jumping on to Exodus 5, verse 1. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. This doesn't lead to the Israelites having to make their bricks without straw, so it's not the greatest of starts for Moses, let's be said. But again, this back and forth then kind of comes between Pharaoh and Moses. And we see this repeated phrase, chapter 7, verse 6. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Exodus 7:10. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. We continue through, though. Pharaoh doesn't budge. So up next, the plagues, as many a Sunday school story will have recounted them. Each with them bringing again a moment for Moses to choose, is he going to do what God says? Because at any point he could have actually said, hold a second, actually I've had enough now. Or this really isn't getting anywhere, God. Come on, surely there's something else we can do. He could have gone, actually, I'm just getting a bit freaked out by this. I don't know, I would be. We read them just so haphazardly. Like, yeah, there's all these boils and hail and frogs, and that's cool, isn't it? Yeah. Just imagine being there and seeing that. Surely there would have been those moments where he could have actually said, actually, no, I'm done with this. But time and time again, he chooses to respond and obey God. So we find this opportunity, this challenge for Moses. Exodus 7:20, Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. Exodus 8:5-6, then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up out of the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land, and so on. Exodus 8:16-17, 9:8-10, 22, 10, 21-22. Time and time again, hopefully getting the point here. God is instructing, guiding Moses, and Moses is responding in obedience, doing all God asks. Until Exodus 11, verse 1-4. Now the Lord has said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and after that he will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people, the men and women alike, are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go through Egypt. And as follows. And so finally, Pharaoh relents. He lets Moses and God's people go. But that's not the end of it. I'm going to jump to Exodus 14. And they've left Egypt. And at this point, they're faced with, on one side there's the Red Sea, and none of them have brought their armbands or floats or that sort of thing. And on the other hand, you've got the Egyptians who are charging at them. And Exodus 14:16, God says, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. Verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. Verse 26, and the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. And then finally, Exodus 14:27, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. Again, story many will know really well, have heard endless times. One we can become so blasé about of what God actually did, but also what Moses is choosing to do in continuing to obey God's crazy instructions. It's choice after choice after choice after choice. And we have this constant decision to listen for and respond to God's leading, to God's voice. So what about us? I was chatting with Emma this week about this morning. What I was feeling, I felt God was giving me to share. And she had two images that came to mind for her. And the first relates to the start of the section we've just reflected on, chapter 3, really, and Moses and the burning bush. And the image was of a defibrillator. Defibrillators are devices that apply an electric charge or current to the heart, either to restore a normal heartbeat, or if the heart rhythm stops due to cardiac arrest, it actually will hopefully help it start beating again. This passage in chapter 3, by this point, Moses he's 40. And it was this moment, almost the restarting of his heart back to the beat and the rhythm that he was meant to have, living, serving, and following God. It was this moment where, again, if he'd have just wandered past, he'd have just ignored that bush. I mean, who knows? Second image related to Moses, kind of the ongoing story, if you will, in these chapters. And it was that image of what hopefully follows the use of a defibrillator, of that normal heartbeat. That line that is interspersed with a series of waves, visually capturing the motion of the heartbeat. Hopefully regular, at the right pace and the right rhythm, as we're meant to have. And is that maybe a picture of what followed for Moses in terms of his obedience, his choices in following God? Now let's be clear. Moses later on disobeyed God. Okay? And that actually meant he didn't make it into the promised land. If you were at Tuesday Fellowship this week, I actually was sharing on Deuteronomy 31, and that moment just before they're going to head in to the promised land, and there's this handing over the baton from Moses to Joshua, because Moses isn't actually going to make it because he disobeyed God. So we mustn't put him on some kind of pedestal of, wasn't he just the most amazing person ever? He was an amazing person, but he makes mistakes just like we all do. But that said, in these chapters, the obedience that Moses showed and the implications of that obedience for God's people were immense. Yet it was about choice after choice after choice after choice. Some of them seemingly very simple instructions, seemingly very mundane activities. The thing is, though, as I was preparing for this, I just had this realization that none of you are Moses, though. Sorry if you hoped you were or thought you were, and neither am I. You know, but this story, I believe, has powerful potential to speak to us in terms of what it means to be obedient as we follow God. Because actually sometimes it is about that constant obedience, that constant choice. You know, obedience with God, yes, it is about that moment of decision to follow Jesus, to actually choose to live for him. Yeah, as the author and the writer, John Mark Comer, puts it, he wrote The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, the book that we kind of reflected on a bit at the start of last year. In his book, Practicing the Way, which I started reading this week, he says this, he says, contrary to what many assume, Jesus did not invite people to convert to Christianity. He didn't even call people to become Christians. He invited people to apprentice under him into a whole new way of living, to be transformed. He invited people to apprentice under him into a whole new way of living, to be transformed. You know, it starts with that moment of obedience. That's our defibrillator moment, if you will. It's followed by, though, as Comer puts it, as a new way of living. In John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He didn't say, I'm one fixed moment in your life that you forever look back to and when you get excited about stuff, but no, I'm not interested in the rest of it. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Because it's recognizing that there are endless moments where we have to make a choice. Sometimes those choices are, really big. Sometimes those choices are massive and they're terrifying, and they cause us to do things that maybe don't make sense to those around us. They might require us to travel or to move or to do something completely different. Sometimes, though, they're really small and no one else notices them, because they're the choices that we make every day. They're the choices that I make as to whether, when I get up in the morning, as someone who likes that kind of early morning rhythm, I choose to open my Bible, or I choose to actually just look on social media and emails and bits and pieces. It's those choices that I make that will never be noticed by anyone else but God, but I believe are just as important as those big ones. The question is, how will we respond? Hopefully it will be to align ourselves with God, resulting in those waves on that heartbeat monitor to be regular and strong and life-giving. And maybe this morning you come or you find yourself in need of that restart. Maybe it's just that reminder that actually you need to be a bit more regular in terms of your conversation with God, in terms of our engagement with him, in terms of our obedience, whatever that looks like. Maybe as has been picked up already this morning, it's remembering the truth that, just like Moses, we'll get it wrong at times. We'll make mistakes. We'll have the best intentions, but we'll let other people down. We'll let ourselves down. And in those moments, it's about returning to God, recognizing that his grace is sufficient. He will give us a second chance, and we need to pick ourselves up, and we need to keep following. Let me pray. God, I thank you that you are interested in our lives. So that's where we're going to be on Tuesday afternoon. That's where we'll be on Thursday evening. That's the things that we've got planned and are expecting to do this week. That's those things that are just going to appear and we find ourselves involved in. Thank you that you are interested in all of that. And I thank you that you are there seeking to help us and inspire us. Holy Spirit, you are longing for the best in us. Pray that you would work by your power in each one of us. You'd help us to work through what does it mean to make that heartbeat rhythm in my life, my spiritual life, be the best it can be. To be as strong as it can be. To be as regular and powerful as it can be. Not comparing it to others, but owning that it's about you and me. And that you long to cheer us on to be all that you've created us to be. Help us to respond to you, Lord. Amen.